government or any government going too far, and to protect the privacy of the individual, the international standard in DNA profiling is restricted to the non-coding region. However, there is no such limitation in the government's bill. Dr. Harshvardhan knows very well what I'm talking about. There should have been a specification that the non-coding is not covered by the bill. Third concern, Mr. Chair, the bill fails to impose a restriction on the exact information to be extracted to create the DNA profile in each of these indices. For instance, the unidentified deceased persons index may require just the physical reconstruction of the person, unlike a crime scene index where two different DNA samples may have to be matched. By failing to impose restrictions on the region of the DNA that can be used for testing, and by failing to limit the information that a DNA profile may contain, this bill will make a large number of people susceptible to profiling based on their skin color, disabilities, medical conditions, and so on. These profiles can be misused, despite the Minister's kind assurances, for surveillance, but also by private sources for making profits, and even for perpetrating crimes, Mr. Chair. This concern is apparent in the schedule of the bill, where the government wants to create DNA profiles for issues relating to pedigree, immigration, and immigration. They have not thought this through adequately, and there are serious concerns. Number 4. The control of our DNA will create a power imbalance between the government and the people. Now, such an imbalance is the hallmark of this government, I'm sorry to say, a government which wants people to show obedience to it. Unlike a democratic setup where the government understands that we exist at the service of the people. That was our approach when we were in government. But this government, unfortunately, has created a situation in which, unfortunately, they have already attempted to extend the use of Aadhaar to control the lives of individuals, even linking Aadhaar to mobile phone numbers, private bank accounts, until the Supreme Court wrapped them on the knuckles. Are they now creating one more bill, waiting for the Supreme Court to wrap them on the knuckles? A government which wants already to dictate to us who we should love, what we should eat and not eat, what we should write and not write, what we can speak and not speak, also wants now to control our DNA, and I think it's a very serious concern for many of us in this country. Number 5, if the government, as the Minister has made clear, still insists on passing this bill in the absence of a special data protection legislation, then clearly additional privacy safeguards must be incorporated. For example, because the Minister was very confident that he had taken care of this concern, let me tell him why he has not. The bill fails to provide standards for effective consent. This is not just a legal term, it's also a common sense term. Effective consent. There is no provision for notice to the individual whose DNA is to be collected. Revocation and deletion in relation to an individual's rights over their DNA samples and DNA profiles. The consent requirement in this bill is so superficial that the word consent has not even been defined in the bill. So what is consent? They can presume consent. By leaving the term consent undefined, it allows for uninformed, unambiguous consent to be obtained, maybe even through coercion, or after the collection and usage of the DNA. If you look at clause 21 and 22 of your bill, it substantially waters down the real essence of consent by allowing the magistrate to override the refusal of consent by any arrested individuals or a refusal by a guardian on behalf of a minor. No guiding factors have been enumerated for the magistrate to keep in mind while exercising such wide powers. This is a very serious threat that the government is essentially imposing on our people. Number 6, the bill does not provide for provision to inform an individual about the details of the collection or usage of his or her DNA. You can go and get a haircut. They can pick up your hair sample from the barber. They won't have to tell you. This bill grants no right for the revocation of DNA samples or profiles, even by those who volunteered for it. Instead, it permits unlimited retention of DNA of volunteers, including victims, in the data bank. This is extended to the DNA collected from a volunteer to identify a missing person, even when the law itself of our country presumes that the missing person is dead if he or she is missing for 7 years. As you know, under the law, If you're missing for 7 years, the law will presume you're dead so your widow can get benefits and so on. In that circumstance, how can they keep this DNA indefinitely? Continuing with this point, in accordance with the privacy judgment, the bill should have been adapted, should have been amended to include the definition of effective consent. The obligation to notify any use or application of the DNA sample or the profile of an individual, an obligation to automatically remove all biological material and related information of any individual, that's all of us in this house, once the purpose for the collection is served, and grant the right to every individual to retrieve your DNA sample. If you have given your DNA sample to the government, you should have the right to take it back. The government should not have the right to keep it forever. Number 8, the government has argued, the minister has argued, that it's provided for safeguards by setting up a DNA regulatory board to ensure compliance to privacy standards by investigating officers, by DNA labs and by DNA data banks. But the irony, Mr. Chairman, is that the members of the DNA Regulatory Board are heads of investigative agencies, DNA laboratories and DNA data banks. In other words, the regulators will be regulating themselves. These are the very people that a regulatory board should be trying to control. Instead of having others, outside experts, scholars, forensic experts, members of parliament, whoever, you have basically given those who are the target of regulation the right to regulate themselves. I find this absolutely astonishing. The government has thrown independence to the winds, the principle of avoiding conflict of interest to the winds. Sorry, sir?
Conclude kariye.
Sir, 5 more points, but I'll be very brief. Number 9, the few safeguards are in relation to the DNA collected from the body of the person. If DNA is collected from the scene of the crime, clothing, other objects, any other source, without any safeguards, you know what the dangers are. DNA laboratories can collect DNA samples from anywhere they please, except from the body of a person, which gives them a large quantum of DNA. As I said, a haircut is enough. There's no regulation of any kind of these DNA samples. In the absence of a prohibition to store or the obligation to destroy, the DNA laboratories can create their own data banks without any government oversight. Anybody can have their DNA stored in the lab without their knowledge, and what clause 31(3) of the bill expects is that an innocent person who probably has no idea that his DNA is even in the DNA data bank, is supposed to request the National DNA Data Bank to remove his or her DNA from it, otherwise it will remain there for eternity. If you don't know that your DNA is in the data bank, how will you ask for it to be removed? This is an impossible burden the bill is imposing on people while letting the DNA labs and data banks potentially misuse the system behind closed doors. Very quickly, so 3 more points. The collection of DNA samples can also get mixed up with the collection of the samples of the investigative officer. So it's an obvious problem. Other countries have anticipated it. Solutions can be found. There is the notion of an elimination index where the DNA samples of all the investigative agents would be collected and would be eliminated from any investigation. That should have been included. Last 2 points are the absence of obligations on law enforcement agencies of the country. There are 5 indices given under the bill, and it's a serious bill, so one can't avoid these details. Unfortunately, the offenders index and so on, the suspect index, under trials index, can be collected by the law enforcement agencies without the consent of the individual, and due to the misconceptions surrounding the infallibility of these samples, they are going to serve as a tremendously important factor in the final judicial decision-making process. It seems to me that they need to do something very, very important to ensure that there's a trusted chain of custody of samples, reliable analysis, proper use of expert evidence in the court. Otherwise, in the absence of these laws, we will be perpetrating an injustice in the criminal justice system. Otherwise, the criminal justice laws, all this bill, should be revised to include effective provision. So last 2 points, this is such a detailed bill, so we have to, I've taken the trouble to come up with this in the interest of our nation, sir. The bill, in the cost estimate, grossly underestimates the amount required for enforcement of the bill. Financial memorandum of the bill estimates non-recurring expenses at 20 crores and recurring expenses at 5 crores for the establishment of everything, the DNA Regulatory Board, National DNA Data Bank, regional DNA data banks, and says no other expenditure beyond this. Now, I give you as a contrast, sir, that to set up one DNA data bank in the UK, it cost 3,000 crores. How can it be 20 crores to set up a bank of equivalent quality in India? It makes no sense. This is an underestimate that is very serious, sir, because the government is asking this parliament to authorize something that may cost 50 times what the government is claiming it will cost here, sir. And the fact is that if you look at the data that has been provided, that the cost of creating just one of the indices, the suspect or under trial index for India, according to data of the Center for DNA Fingerprinting and Diagnostics, says one index would cost 1,800 crores. Now, if that is for one index, how can the government come up with such an irresponsible number? It must be revised, otherwise we will be voting for a sum which is not true, sir. Finally, sir, the minister has said that he will take a call on linking DNA profiles with the Aadhaar database at the time of framing the rules. I do not think this House should be delegating legislative powers to the stage of framing of rules. I think this should be in the law. The minister should, if necessary, bring in an amendment making clear how he intends to use this law. The absence of procedural safeguards, the open-ended manner in which clauses have been drafted, and the very wide discretionary powers vested with the instrumentalities of the state makes it very clear, sir, that this bill fails to abide by the standards of privacy enunciated by the Supreme Court. I do want to say, sir, the minister has one more option. My final suggestion. He could take my objections and those of other speakers, reconsider this bill and refer it to a standing committee for further study and deliberation. Remember, sir, you are now in power. Tomorrow somebody else may be, and these provisions can be misused in ways you may not be happy. I request you to withdraw the bill and send it to a standing committee.